What if the reason you're not getting the promotion, the respect, the relationship you want, has nothing to do with how smart you are, how hard you work, or even who you know, and everything to do with how you speak? Not the words you choose, not your vocabulary, not even your confidence, but the invisible psychology happening beneath every conversation. The silent signals you're sending right now that are either pulling people toward you or pushing them away without you even realizing it. Here's something most people will never tell you. The most successful people in America, the ones running boardrooms, building movements, winning arguments without raising their voice, they're not smarter than you. They haven't lived more. They haven't suffered less. They've just mastered something the school system never taught you. Something your parents probably didn't know either. They understand the psychology behind communication. And once you understand it, everything changes. The way your boss looks at you in meetings. The way strangers treat you when you walk into a room. The way your words land, not just in ears, but in minds, in hearts, in decisions that shape your life. Right now, most people, and I mean 99% of people, are communicating on autopilot, reacting instead of responding, talking instead of connecting, being heard, but never truly understood. That ends today. You're about to spend the next 2 hours with one purpose: to never walk out of a conversation at a disadvantage again. Before we dive in, if this is your first time on Mindset Audiobooks, hit that subscribe button right now. Every single week, we drop audiobooks engineered to rewire the way you think, speak, lead, and live. This channel is built for people who are done with average. If that's you, you're in the right place. Now, let's begin. There's a study out of UCLA that changed the way scientists think about human communication forever. Researchers found that when you're speaking to another person, only 7% of your impact comes from the actual words you say. 7%. The other 93%? It's your tone, your body language, your timing, the energy you carry into the room before you even open your mouth. Now here's why that should stop you cold. Most of us have spent our entire lives focused on the 7%, memorizing better words, rehearsing better answers, building bigger vocabularies. And meanwhile, the 93%, the part that actually moves people, has been running wild, completely untrained, working against us in ways we can't even see. Think about the last time you had a conversation that didn't go the way you wanted. Maybe it was a negotiation where you had all the facts, but somehow walked away with nothing. Maybe it was a first date where the chemistry just died. Or a pitch meeting where your idea was brilliant but the room felt cold. Or maybe it's smaller than that. A family dinner where you said the right words in the wrong way and spent 3 days wondering why everything feels off. Communication failures aren't usually about what you said. They're about what the other person's brain heard, which is a completely different thing. As the legendary Maya Angelou once said, "People will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel." This audiobook is built around that truth. In the next 10 chapters, we're going to go deep into the psychology of how human beings process, respond to, and remember communication. You're going to learn why certain people command instant respect, and how to become one of them. You'll discover the hidden mechanics of persuasion, the neuroscience of trust, the subtle art of silence, and the reason why powerful communicators almost never argue, yet somehow always win. This isn't about becoming someone you're not. It's about unlocking the communicator you were always meant to be. Whether you're an entrepreneur trying to close bigger deals, a professional tired of being talked over in meetings, a parent trying to actually reach your teenager, or someone who's simply spent too long feeling invisible in rooms full of people, this is for you. 10 chapters. 1 transformation. Let's get into it. Chapter 1. The Invisible Signal. Why people decide how they feel about you in 7 seconds. Picture this. You walk into a job interview. You've prepared for weeks. You know your resume cold. You've researched the company. You've got your answers ready. You walk through the door, shake the interviewer's hand, sit down, and within 7 seconds, they've already made up their mind about you. Before you say a single word about your qualifications, before you answer a single question, before you've had any real chance to show them who you are, the decision is already leaning one way. Unfair? Absolutely. But this is not opinion. This is neuroscience. Harvard psychologist Amy Cuddy, who has spent decades studying first impressions, found that people make snap judgments about two things almost instantly when they meet you: warmth and competence. And here's what's wild. They assess your warmth first, before they even get to competence. They're asking unconsciously, completely without thinking, can I trust this person? Are they safe? If the answer is no, if the signal is off, if the energy feels cold or closed or anxious, your competence doesn't matter. The brain has already gone into protect mode, and you're fighting uphill for the rest of the interaction. This is the invisible signal, and most people are broadcasting the wrong one. Now let's break down exactly what's happening in those 7 seconds, because once you understand the mechanics, you can start to shift them. When another human being encounters you for the first time, their amygdala, the brain's threat detection center, fires up immediately. It's scanning you the same way our ancestors scanned the tree line for predators. Is this person safe? Are they powerful? Do they want something from me? Should I open up or shut down? This process happens below conscious thought. The person you're meeting isn't deciding to judge you. Their brain is doing it automatically, the same way it breathes without being told to. And what triggers the signal? 3 things primarily. 1. Eye contact. The moment you make eye contact with someone, a cascade of neural activity begins. Consistent, warm eye contact triggers oxytocin, the same bonding chemical released between a mother and newborn. It signals confidence, presence, honesty. It says, without words, I see you. I'm not hiding. Most people, when they're nervous, and especially in high-stakes conversations, break eye contact too quickly. They look down. They look away. And the brain on the receiving end interprets that as a threat signal. Not intentionally, not consciously, but it happens. Try this experiment this week. In your next conversation, whether it's ordering coffee, sitting in a meeting, or talking to a friend, hold eye contact just 1 second longer than you normally would. Not staring, not intense, just present. Watch what happens to the energy of the conversation. 2. Your posture. Tony Robbins famously said, motion creates emotion. And your posture is the loudest motion in the room before you ever move a muscle to speak. Closed posture, crossed arms, hunched shoulders, a slight lean backward, signals low status, defensiveness, or discomfort. The other person's brain picks this up instantly and unconsciously mirrors it. They begin to feel slightly guarded too, slightly less open. Open posture, shoulders back, feet grounded, chest slightly forward, hands visible, signals safety, confidence, and presence. It says, I belong in this room. I have nothing to hide. I'm not going anywhere. Here's the key. Open posture doesn't just affect how others see you. Research from Amy Cuddy's landmark study on power posing shows that standing in an open, expansive posture for just 2 minutes before a high-stakes interaction actually changes your hormone levels. Testosterone, the dominance hormone, goes up. Cortisol, the stress hormone, goes down. Your body begins to perform the confidence your mind is still catching up to. You can literally physiology your way into a better first impression before the conversation even starts. 3. The quality of your stillness. This one surprises people. Most people, when they're anxious in a conversation, fidget. They touch their face. They shift their weight. They over-smile, over-nod, over-gesture. And while every single one of those things feels normal and natural to them, to the observing brain, it reads as noise, as instability. powerful communicators are still, not rigid, not cold, but settled, like they have all the time in the world. Think about the people in your life who command the most respect, the ones whose opinions carry the most weight. Now think about how they hold themselves when they speak. There's an economy to their movement. Every gesture means something. Their stillness says, without a word, I am not rattled. I am not chasing your approval. I am simply here. That stillness is magnetic, and it's learnable. Now let's bring this into a real-world American context, because the invisible signal shows up differently depending on where you are. Walk into a boardroom in Manhattan versus a backyard barbecue in Nashville. The signals are the same: warmth and competence, trust and strength, but the expression of them shifts. In a professional American setting, the invisible signal is dominated by handshake firmness, eye contact, and the ability to take up physical space without apologizing for it. Americans, culturally, respond powerfully to what psychologists call assertive warmth. The combination of being simultaneously confident and approachable. Not aggressive. Not passive. Assertive. Warm. In a casual setting, a social gathering, a neighborhood conversation, a community meeting, the invisible signal shifts toward relatability. People want to feel like you're one of them, that you're not performing, that the warmth is real. The great communicators, the ones who move through every room with ease, have learned to toggle between these two modes without losing their core signal. That core signal is always the same. I am comfortable in my own skin, and I want you to be comfortable too. Here's a story that puts all of this together. There was a man, let's call him Marcus, a mid-level manager at a tech company in Austin, Texas. Smart guy. Genuinely smart. Knew his product inside and out. Had great ideas in every meeting, but he kept getting passed over for senior leadership. He'd watch colleagues with less experience, sometimes less knowledge, get promoted above him, and he couldn't understand it. When he finally sat down with an executive coach, the coach did something unusual. She didn't ask him about his qualifications. She didn't review his work. She just watched him walk into the room, and in 30 seconds, she had her answer. Marcus walked in slightly hunched, eyes scanning the floor. He smiled too quickly, the eager-to-please smile that says, I hope you like me. He chose a seat near the edge of the table, not the center. When he spoke, his voice was strong, but it trailed off at the ends of sentences, as if he was asking you whether what he just said was okay. He was broadcasting the wrong invisible signal. The coach gave him one assignment. For the next 2 weeks, before he walked into any room, he would pause in the hallway, take 3 slow breaths, pull his shoulders back, soften his jaw, and decide in his own mind, I belong in this room. Not a mantra he was trying to believe. A decision he was making. 8 months later, Marcus got the promotion. Not because he got smarter. Not because he learned more about the product. Because he changed his signal. The way we communicate with others and with ourselves ultimately determines the quality of our lives. Tony Robbins. That quote hits differently now, doesn't it? Because here's what we're really talking about. Communication doesn't start when you open your mouth. It starts in your nervous system. In the way your body holds the story you believe about yourself. And people, every single person you encounter, can read that story before you've said a word. The first step to speaking smarter than 99% of people is understanding that you are always communicating. Always. Even in silence. Even in the way you enter a room, choose a seat, meet a gaze, or look away. The invisible signal is either working for you or against you. And now you know how to take control of it. Let's recap what we've covered in Chapter 1. First impressions form in 7 seconds, and they're based almost entirely on warmth and competence signals, not words. Your eye contact, your posture, and the quality of your stillness are the 3 primary drivers of your invisible signal. Open, grounded, assertive warm body language changes not just how others perceive you, It changes your own neurobiology. And the most powerful shift you can make isn't a technique. It's a decision. The decision that you belong in every room you enter. Coming up in Chapter 2, we're going to go inside the brain and discover why the words you think are persuasive are actually the ones most likely to trigger resistance. The neuroscience of language is about to change the way you open every conversation for the rest of your life. Don't go anywhere. Chapter 2. The neuroscience of words. Why your brain argues before you even finish talking. Here is something that happened to almost every single person listening to this right now, probably within the last week. Someone said something to you. Maybe it was your partner. Maybe it was your boss. Maybe it was a friend, a coworker, a stranger on the internet. And the moment they said it, before they even finished the sentence, something inside you snapped shut. You stopped listening. Not because you decided to stop. Not because you made a conscious choice to tune them out. But because something in your brain hit a silent alarm, and just like that, the conversation was over, even though both of you kept talking. You know exactly what that feels like, don't you? Now here's the question nobody ever asks. What if you are doing that to other people, every single day, without knowing it? What if the words you think are your strongest, most persuasive, most logical words are the very words that are shutting people's brains down before you ever get to your point? Welcome to Chapter 2. Because this is where it gets fascinating. Let's talk about what's happening inside the human brain during a conversation. Because most people picture communication as a simple exchange. You talk, I listen. I talk, you listen. Words go in, understanding comes out. But that's not even close to what's actually happening. The human brain processes approximately 11 million bits of information per second. 11 million. And how much of that reaches conscious awareness? About 40 bits. So while you're sitting across from someone, speaking carefully chosen words, their brain is simultaneously processing your facial micro-expressions, the temperature of the room, a memory from 7 years ago that your tone just accidentally triggered, the hunger signal from their stomach, an unresolved anxiety about a conversation they had yesterday, and somewhere in the middle of all that noise, a sliver of attention is pointed at what you're actually saying. Language, to the brain, is not a neutral channel. Every word you say lands in the brain like a stone dropped in water. And the ripple it creates, the emotional and neurological response it triggers, determines whether the person in front of you opens up or shuts down. As neuroscientist Andrew Newberg and communications expert Mark Waldman wrote in their landmark research, words have the power to change the brain. Not metaphorically, literally. A single negative word activates the brain's fight or flight response. Stress hormones flood the system. And suddenly, rational thought, the part of a person's brain you need them to be using if you want to persuade them, begins to shut down. One word. That's all it takes. And most of us are throwing dozens of them into every important conversation without realizing it. Let's get specific, because this is where communication changes for you permanently. There are what psychologists call threat-triggering language patterns. Specific categories of words and phrases that, regardless of your intention, send the other person's nervous system into a defensive state. Once that happens, you're not talking to their rational mind anymore. You're talking to their armor. The first pattern is absolute language. Words like always, never, every time, you constantly, without fail. These words are cognitive grenades. The moment someone hears, you always do this, or you never listen, their brain does not process the content of the complaint. Instead, it immediately goes searching for the one exception that proves you wrong. Because if there's one exception, and there always is, then your entire statement is false. And now the conversation has shifted from the real issue to a debate about the accuracy of your word choice. You've lost the room. And you haven't even made your point yet. Replace absolute language with specific and bounded language. Instead of "you never support my ideas," try "in yesterday's meeting, when I proposed the new strategy, I felt like I didn't have your support." Now there's nothing to argue. It's a specific moment. It's your experience. It's undeniable and it's real. The brain on the receiving end has nowhere to retreat, so it actually listens. The second pattern is the word, but. This one is subtle and it is devastating. I really appreciate your effort, but the results weren't where we needed them. What did the brain hear? It erased everything before the word, but, completely, neurologically, but functions as a negation signal. It tells the brain that everything preceding it was filler, and the real message is what follows. So what your listener actually heard was, the results weren't where we needed them. The appreciation? Gone. Deleted. As if it was never said. Start replacing but with and. I really appreciate your effort, and I think there are some specific adjustments that could take the results to the next level. Now both ideas exist simultaneously. The compliment is real. The critique is real. The brain can hold both. And the person in front of you stays open instead of defensive. It sounds like a small change. It produces enormous shifts. The third pattern, and this one surprises people, is over-explanation. Most people believe that the more reasoning they provide, the more persuasive they become. If I just give enough evidence, enough logic, enough justification, surely they'll have to agree with me. But the brain doesn't work that way. Research from Columbia University found that past a certain threshold, adding more arguments to a position actually weakens it in the listener's mind. Why? Because the brain interprets over-explanation as insecurity. If you were truly confident in your position, you wouldn't need to bury it in 40 layers of justification. The volume of your reasoning signals doubt, even when you feel anything but. Powerful communicators know this. They make their point. They support it with one strong, specific piece of evidence. And then they stop. The silence after a well-made point is not empty. It is the most persuasive space in any conversation. Now let's bring in the flip side, because the neuroscience of language isn't only about what to avoid. It's equally about what to activate. Neurolinguistic research has identified what are called approach state triggers. Words, phrases, and patterns that open the brain rather than closing it. That shift the listener from a threat response to a curiosity response. And when someone is in a curiosity response, they are neurologically primed to receive what you're saying. The most powerful approach state triggers are inclusive language. Words like we, us, together, our, these activate the brain's social bonding circuitry. They signal alliance rather than opposition. They say, we are on the same side of this table. Research from Stanford shows that groups using more inclusive language in negotiation consistently achieve better outcomes than those using competitive language, even when the competitive group had the stronger position on paper. Think about what that means. Your language can outperform your argument. Curiosity framing. Rather than stating your position as a conclusion, frame it as an exploration. I've been thinking about something, and I'd love your take on it. What would you say if I told you? Here's something I came across that completely changed the way I think about this. These phrases do something remarkable. They transfer ownership of the idea to the listener. Their brain leans forward. Curiosity is activated. And a curious brain is an open brain, naming emotions before making points. This one comes straight from the world of hostage negotiation, and if it works when someone's holding a weapon, it will absolutely work in your next difficult conversation. Before you make your argument, name the emotional reality of the room. I know this is a sensitive topic. I imagine this is hard to hear. I understand there's a lot of frustration around this situation. When you name an emotion accurately, the brain experiences a phenomenon called affect labeling. The emotional charge of the feeling decreases the moment it's acknowledged. You are literally calming the nervous system of the person you're talking to. And a calm nervous system is a receptive one. Gary Vaynerchuk once said, "Empathy is the most important thing. When you actually care about the other side, you win." And while that might sound soft, it is grounded in hard neuroscience. Empathy, expressed through the right language, lowers cortisol, increases oxytocin, and moves the listener from a defended state to an engaged one, all before you've even made your case. Let's ground this in a story, because this principle plays out in real American life more than most people realize. There's a woman, call her Danielle, a sales manager in Chicago. Brilliant at her job. Knew her product, knew her numbers, knew exactly how to structure a pitch. But she kept hitting a wall with a particular category of client. The skeptical, seen it all, show me the proof type that is practically a defining personality in the Chicago business world. Her pitches were logical. They were thorough. They were, by every objective measure, correct. And they kept failing. Her mentor finally sat in on one of her meetings and afterward said just one thing to her. He said, "Danielle, you're giving them a court case when they just want a conversation." She was front-loading her pitch with data, history, comparison charts, and case studies, before she'd ever made the client feel understood. Their brains were processing threat before they were processing information. They were in defense mode before she'd even asked them anything. She restructured her entire approach. She started every meeting by naming the client's reality first. Based on what you've shared, it sounds like the biggest challenge you're facing right now is. She replaced absolute claims with specific evidence. She dropped the word, but, from her vocabulary almost entirely. She learned to make her point, back it with one powerful specific, and then go quiet. Her close rate increased by 34% in 1 quarter. Same product, same market, same Danielle, different language. The single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place. George Bernard Shaw. That quote should hang on the wall of every office in America, because it captures the central tragedy of most conversations. Both people think communication happened, but the brain on the receiving end encoded something completely different from what was intended. The neuroscience of language teaches us that intention is not enough. Sincerity is not enough. Even intelligence is not enough. What matters is whether the words you choose activate opening or closing in the nervous system of the person in front of you. Now you know the difference. Here's your recap from Chapter 2 before we move forward. The brain processes language as a threat or safety signal before it processes it as information. Absolute language, the word, but, and over-explanation are the 3 primary patterns that trigger defensive shutdown. Inclusive language, curiosity framing, and emotional labeling are the 3 primary patterns that trigger an open, receptive brain state. And the space after a well-made point, that deliberate, confident silence, is not weakness. It is the most underused persuasion tool in the English language. You now understand something most people will go their entire lives without knowing. The words you speak are not just sounds. They are neurological events happening inside another person's brain. And you are the one choosing what those events feel like. In Chapter 3, we are going inside the one communication skill that the most successful negotiators, leaders, therapists, and salespeople in the world share, and that almost nobody talks about. It's not about what you say. It's about what you hear. The art of listening so powerfully that people feel like you've read their mind. That's coming up next. And trust me, you don't want to miss it. Stay with us. Chapter 3. The Lost Art of Listening. Hear so deeply that people think you can read their mind. There is a skill so rare, so quietly powerful, that the people who have mastered it are described by others in almost mystical terms. People say things like, "She just gets me," or "I don't know what it is about him, but every time I talk to him, I feel completely understood," or "Somehow she always knows exactly what I need to hear." And the person being described walks away from that conversation having said less than anyone else in the room. That skill is listening, but not the kind of listening you think. Not the polite, nodding, waiting for your turn to talk listening that most people perform every day while secretly rehearsing their next sentence. Not the kind where your eyes are on the speaker but your brain is 3 sentences ahead, building your response, sharpening your comeback, preparing your opinion. The kind of listening we're talking about in this chapter is something categorically different. It is an active, disciplined, deeply human skill that the world's most effective communicators, the top negotiators, the most trusted therapists, the leaders people would walk through fire for, have spent years deliberately developing. And once you learn it, people will not just feel heard by you. They will feel known by you. And that distinction, the difference between being heard and being known, is the difference between a conversation and a connection that lasts a lifetime. Let's start with a hard truth, because you deserve honesty. Most people are terrible listeners, and they have no idea. A study published in the Harvard Business Review found that people remember only 25 to 50% of what they hear, even in conversations they consider important. That means in your last meaningful conversation, half of what was said to you is already gone. Vanished. Not stored, not processed, not retained. And here's what makes that statistic even more striking. When people in the same study were asked to rate their own listening ability, the overwhelming majority rated themselves as above average. Everyone thinks they're a good listener. Almost nobody is. And the reason isn't laziness or selfishness, although those can play a role. The real reason is biological. The human brain can process language at roughly 400 words per minute, but the average person speaks at only 125 to 175 words per minute. That gap, that massive cognitive surplus, is where most listening dies. Your brain, bored by the pace of incoming speech, fills the leftover bandwidth with internal chatter, judgments, associations, memories, rebuttals. You are literally thinking yourself out of the conversation while it's happening. The question is, what do you do with that gap instead? The answer lies in what psychologists call active listening, but that term has been so overused in corporate training seminars that it's lost almost all of its meaning. So let's strip it back down to the neuroscience and rebuild it from scratch. When a person speaks to you, they are communicating on 3 simultaneous levels at once. Most people only catch one of them. The first level is the content level. This is the surface, the actual words, the stated facts, the explicit information being shared. The project is behind schedule. I've been feeling overwhelmed lately. I don't think this relationship is working. This is the level almost everyone responds to, and it's the least important of the 3. The second level is the emotional level. Beneath every statement is a feeling, and often, the feeling is the real message. When your colleague says, the project is behind schedule, what they might actually be communicating is fear. Fear of failure, fear of judgment, fear of disappointing someone they respect. When your partner says, I've been feeling overwhelmed, the content is stress, but the emotional message might be loneliness, a quiet plea for presence and partnership. When someone says, I don't think this is working, the content is a conclusion, but the emotion underneath might be grief. Grief that things didn't become what they hoped they would. Most conflicts in American homes, offices, and communities exist because someone responded to the content level while the other person was crying out from the emotional level. The words got answered. The human being did not. The third level is the identity level. This is the deepest and most rarely acknowledged layer of any conversation. Every significant thing a person says is connected, somewhere beneath the surface, to how they see themselves, their sense of worth, their fear of inadequacy, their need for respect and belonging. When a colleague pushes back aggressively on your idea in a meeting, the content might be disagreement, but the identity level message might be, I need to feel like my expertise matters here. When a teenager shuts down and stops talking, the content is silence, but the identity level message is often, I don't feel safe enough to be honest with you yet. The communicators who listen at all 3 levels simultaneously, who can hear the content, feel the emotion, and honor the identity in a single response, are the ones described as almost magical by the people around them. And it is absolutely a learnable skill. Here is the framework. 3 practices, grounded in research, that will transform the quality of your listening within days of applying them. Practice 1. The listen to understand pause. Before you respond to anything said to you, particularly in high-stakes conversations, Take a breath and ask yourself one internal question. What is this person most needing me to understand right now? Not what do they want me to say. Not whether they're right or wrong. Not how this affects me. Simply, what do they most need me to understand? That one internal question shifts your entire orientation. It moves you from a response mode brain to a reception mode brain. And the person across from you feels that shift, even though they can't articulate it. They feel the quality of your attention change. They feel safer. And safer people share more honestly, open more fully, and trust more deeply. Research from the Gottman Institute, which has spent over 4 decades studying human communication in relationships, found that the single most consistent predictor of long-term relationship quality, both professional and personal, was not compatibility, not shared values, not even communication frequency. It was what they called attunement, the ability to turn toward another person's emotional signals with genuine curiosity and responsiveness. Attunement begins with that one internal question. Practice 2. Reflective listening. This is the technique used by the world's best hostage negotiators, executive coaches, and therapists. And it is almost absurdly simple, which is why most people underestimate it completely. Reflective listening means that before you make your own point, you reflect back what you just heard, in your own words, not theirs, with the specific intent of demonstrating that you understood not just the content, but the meaning beneath it. It sounds like this. So what I'm hearing is that you're feeling like your contributions aren't being recognized, and that's been building up for a while. Is that right? Or this. It sounds like what's really frustrating isn't the deadline itself. It's feeling like the decision was made without your input. Notice what that does. The other person doesn't just feel heard. They feel seen. And there is a profound neurological difference between those two experiences. Being heard activates the auditory cortex. Being seen activates the brain's reward circuitry, the same pathway triggered by food, warmth, and human touch. You are, quite literally, making the other person's brain feel good just by listening to them accurately. And once someone's brain is in a reward state in your presence, they become more cooperative, more open, more willing to hear your perspective in return. You haven't even made your point yet, and you're already winning. Practice 3. Eliminating the listener's ego. This is the hardest one, and it is the one that separates the genuinely powerful listeners from everyone else. The listener's ego is the part of you that cannot simply receive information without evaluating it against your own experience. It is the voice that hears, "I had the worst day today," and immediately thinks about your worst day. It hears a problem and immediately reaches for a solution. Not because the person asked for one, but because your ego needs to feel useful, needs to feel knowledgeable, needs to contribute something visible. Stephen Covey put it simply and permanently when he said, "Most people do not listen with the intent to understand. They listen with the intent to reply." Eliminating the listener's ego doesn't mean you become passive or silent. It means you develop the discipline to fully receive what someone is sharing before your own perspective enters the room. It means sitting in the slight discomfort of not yet responding, which, if you let it, becomes one of the most powerful signals of respect you can send another human being. In American culture specifically, where speed is celebrated and silence is often misread as weakness, this practice is extraordinarily rare, which means the moment you develop it, you stand out in every room you enter. People describe you as someone who is easy to talk to, when what they actually mean is that you make them feel safe enough to be honest, which is among the rarest and most valuable things one human being can offer another. Here is the story that brings this to life. There is a man, call him James, a regional director at a mid-size logistics company in Atlanta. James was known as a strong leader, results-oriented, smart, decisive. But his team's turnover rate was quietly one of the highest in the company. People liked him, but they didn't stay. In an exit interview, a departing employee said something that stopped James cold. She said, "I never felt like my problems were actually heard." James would ask how things were going, and before I'd finished my second sentence, he was already giving me solutions. I never felt like he actually wanted to understand. I felt like he wanted to fix things so he could move on. James wasn't a bad leader. He wasn't dismissive or unkind. He genuinely cared. But his listening was entirely content level, and his team was communicating from the emotional and identity levels, and finding nothing there to receive them. He spent 3 months practicing reflective listening. He learned to ask one more question before offering any solution. He trained himself to name the emotional layer he was picking up before addressing the practical one. Within 6 months, his team's retention rate improved dramatically. Not because the work changed, not because the pay changed, because the quality of being listened to by their leader changed. And people will stay in hard circumstances far longer when they feel genuinely understood than they will in comfortable circumstances where they feel invisible. That is the power of listening, not as a soft skill, as a strategic one. Listening is an art that requires attention over talent, spirit over ego, and others over self. Dean Jackson. That line deserves a moment of silence, because it reframes everything. Listening isn't passive. It isn't the absence of speaking. It is an active, disciplined, ongoing choice to place another human being's reality above your own impulse to respond. And that choice, made consistently, made with genuine intention, makes you one of the rarest communicators alive. Here is your recap from Chapter 3 before we move forward. Most people listen at only the content level while every meaningful conversation is happening simultaneously at the emotional and identity levels. The listen to understand pause, reflective listening, and eliminating the listener's ego are the 3 practices that transform you into the kind of communicator people describe as almost impossible to find. And in a culture built for speed and response, the person who learns to receive fully before they reply becomes the most trusted person in every room they enter. You are not just learning to hear better. You are learning to make people feel known, and that changes everything. In Chapter 4, we are going somewhere most communication books never dare to go: the psychology of silence. Why the most powerful thing you can say in any conversation is sometimes absolutely nothing at all. How strategic silence builds authority, breaks resistance, and wins negotiations without a single argument. That's next. And it might be the chapter that changes the most about the way you move through the world. Don't go anywhere. Chapter 4. The Power of Silence. Why saying nothing is sometimes the loudest thing you can do. Imagine you are sitting across from someone in a negotiation. The offer is on the table. You've made your case. And now, instead of filling the air with more words, more justification, more reassurance, you simply stop talking. You hold eye contact. You stay calm. You let the silence exist. Most people in that moment cannot last 10 seconds before they start talking again. They fill the space with qualifiers, with backtracking, with nervous laughter, with unnecessary additions that quietly signal one thing to the brain of the person across from them. I am not comfortable. I am not certain. I need you to respond so I can feel safe again. And the moment that signal lands, the negotiation shifts. The power shifts. And almost always, it shifts away from the person who broke the silence. Now imagine the person who doesn't break it, who sits in that quiet with the ease of someone who has nowhere else to be, nothing to prove, and complete confidence that the offer they made was good enough to stand on its own. Who lets the silence do what silence does, which is apply the kind of pressure that no amount of words ever could. That person wins more negotiations, commands more respect, and moves through difficult conversations with a quiet authority that most people spend their entire lives trying to achieve through volume. And that person understands something the rest of the world doesn't. That silence is not the absence of communication. Silence is one of the most sophisticated communication tools ever discovered. And almost nobody is using it consciously. Let's understand why silence works the way it does, because the neuroscience here is genuinely fascinating. The human brain has what researchers call an intolerance for ambiguity. It is hardwired, at a deep evolutionary level, to fill gaps, to resolve uncertainty, to close open loops. This is the same mechanism that makes you hum a song you can't get out of your head, Your brain is trying to reach a resolution that hasn't come yet. It is the same mechanism that makes cliffhangers so addictive, that makes an unanswered question feel almost physically uncomfortable. And in conversation, silence creates that exact same unresolved loop. When you stop speaking and don't fill the air, the other person's brain immediately begins trying to close the gap. It generates thoughts, interpretations, responses, and most critically, it begins searching for ways to resolve the discomfort. And the most natural way to resolve conversational discomfort is to fill the silence yourself. Which means the person who stays quiet is, neurologically speaking, transferring the pressure of the conversation entirely onto the other person, without aggression, without manipulation, without a single additional word. This is why experienced negotiators, attorneys, therapists, and interviewers are trained specifically in what is called the strategic pause, the deliberate withholding of response as a communication act in itself. FBI negotiator Chris Voss, who spent decades talking people out of the most dangerous situations imaginable, built much of his methodology around the strategic use of silence. In his experience, the single most underused tool in any high-stakes conversation is the willingness to simply stop talking and let reality settle. He called it letting the other person fill the air. And what people say when they fill silence, especially uncomfortable silence, is almost always more revealing, more honest, and more useful than anything you could have pulled from them with direct questioning. Now let's break down the 4 distinct ways silence functions as a communication tool, because they are not all the same, and knowing when to deploy each one is what separates the strategic communicator from someone who just happens to be quiet. The first function is the pressure pause. This is the silence after a statement, offer, or question, the one we open this chapter with. When used correctly, the pressure pause communicates absolute confidence in what you just said. It signals that you do not need to supplement, defend, or soften your position. It places the full weight of decision on the other person, where it belongs. The pressure pause is extraordinarily effective in salary negotiations, sales conversations, and any situation where you have made a request and are waiting for a response. The data on this is remarkable. Studies on negotiation behavior consistently show that the party who speaks first after an offer is made almost always concedes ground. Not because their position was weaker, because their discomfort with silence was stronger. If you apply nothing else from this entire chapter, apply this. After you make your next important ask, for a raise, for a contract, for an agreement, close your mouth and count to 10 in your head before you say another word. It will feel like an eternity. Hold it anyway. The second function is the reflective silence. This is the pause you take before you respond to something difficult, provocative, or emotionally charged. And unlike the pressure pause, this one is not about power, it is about precision. When someone says something that triggers a reaction in you, the least effective thing you can do is respond from that triggered state. Your words come out defensive, reactive, and emotionally loud, and the other person's brain goes immediately into its own defensive mode. Now you have 2 triggered nervous systems trying to have a rational conversation, which is approximately as productive as trying to navigate with 2 broken compasses. The reflective silence, even just 3 to 5 seconds of visible stillness before you respond, does several things simultaneously. It prevents you from saying the first thing that comes to mind, which is rarely the best thing. It signals to the other person that you are taking their words seriously enough to consider them before responding, which is deeply disarming. And it gives your prefrontal cortex, the rational, strategic part of your brain, time to come back online after the emotional activation. Abraham Lincoln reportedly kept what he called hot letters. Letters he wrote in anger and then never sent. He understood that the pause between impulse and action is where wisdom lives. The reflective silence is that pause, applied in real time. The third function is the empathic silence. There are moments in conversation, and if you have ever sat with someone in real pain, you know exactly what this feels like, where words are not just insufficient. They are intrusive. When someone is grieving, when someone is processing a shock, when someone has just been honest about something deeply vulnerable, reaching immediately for words is an instinct born from your own discomfort, not from their need. The brain wants to fix, to comfort, to resolve, and so it generates language as a tool for doing so. But sometimes the most profound thing you can offer another human being is the dignity of your silent, fully present witness. To sit with them in the weight of what they're feeling without rushing to lighten it, without filling the space with platitudes, without making their pain smaller so that your discomfort becomes more manageable. Empathic silence communicates something that no combination of words can fully replicate. It says, "I am not afraid of what you're feeling. I am not going anywhere. You do not have to perform okayness for me right now." In American culture, where productivity is prized, discomfort is avoided, and there is an almost reflexive pressure to stay positive, the ability to simply be present in someone's difficult moment without speaking is among the rarest and most profoundly human things one person can offer another. The fourth function is the authority silence. This is perhaps the most misunderstood of the four, and once you recognize it, you will see it everywhere. Have you ever noticed that the most respected person in any room is rarely the loudest one? That the leader whose words carry the most weight is often the one who speaks least frequently? That when certain people finally do choose to speak, the entire energy of the room shifts and everyone leans in? That is the authority silence at work. Authority is not built by filling every available moment with your voice. It is built by the selectivity of when you choose to use it. Every unnecessary word you add to a conversation is a small withdrawal from your credibility account. Every time you ramble past your point, hedge your statement with a cascade of qualifiers, or keep talking because silence makes you uncomfortable, you are communicating, beneath the content of your words, a quiet desperation for validation. The most authoritative communicators in every field, in business, in politics, in creative leadership, speak with what can only be described as economy. They choose their moments. They make their point. They trust the silence that follows. And that trust, that absolute, unperformed confidence in the weight of what they just said, is what the brain on the receiving end interprets as power. Here is the story that locks all of this into place. There is a woman, call her Patricia, a senior attorney in Washington, D.C., known among her peers for a courtroom presence that opposing counsel found genuinely unsettling. Not because she was aggressive, not because she was loud, but because of what she did after asking a question on cross-examination. She asked it, and then she went completely still. No follow-up, no leading, no subtle facial expression hinting at what she wanted the answer to be. Just absolute, unreadable stillness, and the full, unblinking weight of her attention on the witness. Junior attorneys in her firm used to watch from the gallery just to study it. Because what happened, almost every single time, was that the witness, uncomfortable in that silence, desperate to fill it, often without any coaching on how to handle it, would keep talking. They would add. They would clarify. They would qualify. And in that surplus of words born from discomfort, they almost always gave Patricia exactly what she needed. She once told a mentee, "The most dangerous thing a witness can do on my stand is misunderstand my silence for confusion. My silence is never confusion. My silence is the question still waiting to be answered honestly." That reframe alone, silence as a question still waiting to be answered, is worth carrying into every difficult conversation you will ever have. Wise men speak because they have something to say. Fools speak because they have to say something. Plato. Read that again. Slowly. Because that distinction, between having something to say and needing to say something, is the entire gap between communication that commands respect and communication that fills air. The need to speak, when it is driven by discomfort rather than content, is one of the most reliable signals of low communicative confidence. And the ability to sit in silence, grounded, present, completely at ease, is one of the most reliable signals of the opposite. You do not have to earn your place in a conversation by filling it. Your presence is enough. Your attention is enough. And when you do speak, because you have chosen to, not because the silence became unbearable, every word you say carries the weight of everything you chose not to say before it. That is authority. That is presence. That is the power of silence. Here is your recap from Chapter 4 before we move forward. The brain is neurologically wired to fill silence, which means strategic silence transfers conversational pressure without aggression or argument. The four functions of silence, the pressure pause, the reflective silence, the empathic silence, and the authority silence, each serve a distinct and powerful purpose in different conversational contexts. Silence after a well-made point is not weakness or uncertainty. It is confidence made audible. And in a world where everyone is competing to be the loudest voice in the room, the person who masters the discipline of purposeful silence becomes the one that everyone leans in to hear. Chapter 5 is where we go into one of the most misunderstood dynamics in all of human communication, the hidden psychology of influence, and how the most persuasive people in America are not the ones making the best arguments, but the ones who have mastered something far older, far deeper, and far more powerful than logic. That is coming up next, and it will permanently change the way you think about how decisions are actually made. Stay with us. Chapter 5. The Hidden Psychology of Influence. Why the best argument almost never wins. Here is a question that should genuinely disturb you. Think about the last time you had all the facts, every number lined up, every logical argument airtight, every piece of evidence stacked in your favor. You walked into that conversation, or that meeting, or that dinner table debate, completely prepared, completely correct, and completely confident that the sheer weight of your reasoning would carry the day. And you lost anyway, not because your facts were wrong, not because the other person had better data, but because something else, something invisible, something that had nothing to do with logic or evidence or the objective merit of your position, determined the outcome before the first word was spoken. If that has happened to you, and it has happened to virtually every person listening to this right now, then you have already experienced the most important truth about human influence that most people spend their entire lives refusing to accept. Human beings do not make decisions with logic. They make decisions with emotion, and then they use logic to justify those decisions after the fact. This is not a cynical opinion. This is not a communication philosophy. This is documented, replicated, peer-reviewed neuroscience. And once you truly absorb it, not just intellectually, but in the way you actually approach every important conversation, you will never think about influence the same way again. Let's go inside the brain for a moment, because the architecture here explains everything. Neuroscientist Antonio Damasio spent years studying patients who had suffered damage to the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, the region of the brain most closely associated with emotional processing. These patients were, by every conventional measure, perfectly rational. Their intelligence was intact. Their memory was intact. Their ability to analyze information and construct logical arguments was completely unaffected. But they could not make decisions, even simple ones. Which restaurant to go to? Which shirt to wear? What time to schedule a meeting? Without the emotional processing center to assign weight, to make one option feel more right than another, they became paralyzed. They could generate endless rational analysis but had no mechanism for actually choosing. What Damasio's research revealed, and what has since been confirmed by decades of subsequent neuroscience, is that emotion is not the enemy of good decision-making. Emotion is the engine of decision-making. Logic provides the map. Emotion decides whether you actually get in the car. This single insight explains more about human behavior, about why people buy things they don't need, stay in situations that don't serve them, follow leaders who aren't the most qualified, and reject ideas that are objectively superior than almost any other finding in modern psychology. And it completely reframes what influence actually is. Influence is not the art of building a better argument. Influence is the art of creating the right emotional conditions, so that the decision you want someone to make feels, to them, like the most natural thing in the world. Now let's break down the psychology, because this is where it gets specific, and specific is where it gets useful. There are three primary emotional drivers that govern virtually every significant decision a human being makes. Not the small decisions, not what to order for lunch or which route to take home. The decisions that matter. The ones about trust, commitment, investment, loyalty, and change. The first driver is the need for certainty. The human brain is a prediction machine. Its primary job, above everything else, is to anticipate what comes next and keep the body safe. Uncertainty, to the brain, is not just uncomfortable. It is neurologically registered as a threat. Research from University College London found that people experience more stress from not knowing whether something bad will happen than from knowing something bad definitely will happen. Read that again. People prefer certain bad news over uncertain outcomes. That is how deeply the brain craves predictability. What this means for influence is enormous. When you want someone to say yes to something, a new idea, a changed behavior, an unfamiliar commitment, the most powerful thing you can do is reduce their sense of uncertainty. Not by drowning them in data, but by making the feeling of the decision feel familiar, safe, and low risk. This is why storytelling is the most ancient and most effective persuasion tool in human history. When you frame your idea as a story, when you show someone a narrative of someone like them who faced a situation like theirs and made a choice like the one you're proposing and arrived somewhere better, you are not providing logical evidence. You are providing emotional evidence. You are making the unfamiliar feel familiar. And a familiar feeling is a safe feeling. And a safe feeling opens the door to yes. The second driver is the need for significance. Every human being alive carries, at some level of their awareness, a fundamental need to matter, to be seen as valuable, capable, and worthy of respect. This is not vanity. It is as basic to human psychological functioning as food and water. Abraham Maslow understood this decades ago when he placed esteem needs at the fourth tier of his famous hierarchy, just below self-actualization. And in the context of influence, understanding the significance need changes everything about how you frame your requests. When you ask someone to do something, the unconscious question their brain is always asking is, does saying yes to this make me feel more significant or less? If agreeing with your idea makes them feel smart, capable, visionary, or respected, the emotional pull toward yes is powerful. If it makes them feel criticized, outmaneuvered, or diminished in any way, no amount of logical evidence will move them, because their brain has already registered the decision as a threat to their identity. This is why the most skilled influencers in business, the ones closing the biggest deals, building the most loyal teams, winning the most competitive negotiations, have developed what can only be described as an instinct for making the other person feel more significant through the act of agreeing. They frame proposals as collaboration rather than conquest. They position the other person's input as essential rather than optional. They make yes feel not like surrender, but like leadership. The third driver is the need for connection. Harvard University conducted one of the longest studies in human history, the Harvard Study of Adult Development, running for over 80 years, and its conclusion was both simple and staggering. The quality of your relationships is the single strongest predictor of your happiness, your health, and the length of your life. More than wealth, more than fame, more than professional achievement. Human beings are tribal animals. The need for genuine connection, for feeling that we are understood, that we belong, that the person across from us actually cares about our well-being, is not a preference. It is a survival drive, and it shows up in every important decision we make. Studies on consumer behavior have repeatedly found that people will pay more, wait longer, and tolerate more inconvenience for a product or service when they feel genuinely connected to the person or brand providing it. Studies on workplace performance consistently show that employees perform at higher levels, not for more money, not for better titles, but for managers who make them feel genuinely valued and understood. Connection is not the soft side of influence. Connection is the foundation of influence. Without it, your most logical argument is a building without ground beneath it. Now let's bring this into the real world, because these three drivers play out in American professional and personal life every single day, and recognizing them in the moment is where theory becomes power. There is a man, call him Robert, a financial advisor in Phoenix, Arizona. Technically excellent, deeply knowledgeable. His investment strategies were genuinely among the best in his firm. But he kept losing clients to a colleague, Call him Danny, whose analytical abilities were, by most objective measures, somewhat inferior to Robert's. Robert could not understand it. The numbers didn't lie. His track record was better. His strategy was sounder. His logic was tighter. So one day he sat in on one of Danny's client meetings. And within 20 minutes, he understood everything. Danny opened the meeting by spending 15 minutes asking about the client's family, their retirement dreams, their fears about the future, and what financial security actually meant to them emotionally. He listened with complete attention. He reflected back what he heard. He made the client feel like the most important person in the room. Then, and only then, did he talk about numbers. And when he did, he framed every strategy not as a logical proposition but as a direct response to what the client had just told him they valued. He connected every financial decision to certainty, to significance, to the client's stated vision of a life well lived. Robert went back to his desk that afternoon and rewrote his entire client presentation. Not the data. The data was fine. He rewrote the emotional architecture of how he communicated the data. Within 2 quarters, his client retention rate was the highest in the office. Same knowledge, same market, different understanding of what actually drives human decisions. Logic makes people think. Emotion makes people act. Tony Robbins. That line is the entire chapter in 11 words. Because thinking and acting are not the same thing. You can think your way to understanding someone's argument and still feel nothing that compels you to move. But when emotion is activated, when certainty, significance, and connection are all present in a conversation, action becomes almost inevitable. The most influential people in America are not the ones with the most facts. They are the ones who understand that every human being they are speaking to is carrying 3 invisible needs into every conversation. The need to feel certain, the need to feel significant, and the need to feel connected. And that the moment those needs are honored, the logical case almost makes itself. You do not persuade people. You create the conditions in which people persuade themselves. Here is your recap from Chapter 5 before we move forward. The brain makes decisions emotionally and justifies them logically, which means emotional architecture matters more than logical structure in any persuasive conversation. The 3 primary emotional drivers of human decision-making are the need for certainty, the need for significance, and the need for connection. The most effective influencers don't have better arguments. They create better emotional conditions. And the moment you stop trying to win the argument and start focusing on honoring the person, the outcome of almost every important conversation begins to shift in your favor. In Chapter 6, we are going to tackle something that quietly destroys more careers, more relationships, and more opportunities in America than almost any other communication failure. The way most people handle conflict. Not how to avoid it, not how to win it, but how to transform it into the single most powerful trust-building tool available to any communicator. That is coming up next, and it will completely change the way you walk into your next difficult conversation. Don't go anywhere. Chapter 6. The Conflict Advantage. How to turn your hardest conversations into your greatest trust-building moments. Most people spend enormous amounts of energy trying to avoid conflict. They soften their words until the real message disappears completely. They delay difficult conversations until the problem has grown 3 sizes larger than it needed to be. They smile through disagreements at work, swallow frustrations at home, and tell themselves that keeping the peace is the same thing as building it. When deep down, in the part of themselves they rarely examine honestly, they know those 2 things are nothing alike. And the cost of that avoidance is staggering. Not just in missed opportunities, not just in unresolved tension that quietly poisons relationships and teams and families over time, but in the loss of something far more valuable than comfort. The loss of the depth that only comes from 2 people being honest enough with each other to navigate something hard together and come out the other side still standing. Here is the truth that most communication books will dance around but never say directly. Conflict, handled with skill, is not a threat to your relationships. It is the building material of your best ones. Every significant relationship in your life, every partnership, every friendship, every professional alliance worth having, has been deepened not by the easy conversations, but by the hard ones that both people were willing to have anyway. The problem is not conflict itself. The problem is that almost nobody was ever taught how to do it well. Let's start by understanding what's actually happening inside the brain during conflict, because without this foundation, every tactical advice about difficult conversations floats without an anchor. When a conversation becomes confrontational, when voices tighten, when stakes feel high, when disagreement shifts from intellectual to personal, the brain undergoes a rapid and dramatic change in operating mode. The amygdala, which we discussed in Chapter 1, fires a threat signal. Cortisol and adrenaline flood the system. Blood flow literally shifts away from the prefrontal cortex, the rational, empathetic, strategically intelligent part of your brain, and toward the limbic system, which is concerned with one thing and one thing only: survival. Neuroscientists call this the amygdala hijack, a term coined by psychologist Daniel Goleman in his landmark work on emotional intelligence. And during an amygdala hijack, you are not operating at your most intelligent, your most empathetic, or your most persuasive. You are operating on instinct, on pattern, on the emotional vocabulary you developed decades ago, long before you had any sophisticated understanding of how communication actually works. Which is why most people, in their most important conflicts, sound like the least evolved version of themselves. Not because they're not smart, not because they don't care, but because their brain has temporarily gone offline, and the version of them that's left in charge is running on survival programming, not communication strategy. Understanding this changes everything, because the first and most essential skill in conflict is not knowing what to say. It is knowing how to keep your brain online long enough to say it well. There is a framework used by the world's top executive coaches, conflict resolution specialists, and organizational psychologists. And it works because it is built around the actual neuroscience of how the brain behaves under pressure. It has 3 stages, and together they form what conflict experts call the transformation sequence, the pathway from destructive conflict to constructive resolution. Stage 1. The regulation phase. Before you can have a productive conflict conversation, both nervous systems in the room need to be regulated enough to access rational thought. This sounds obvious. It is almost universally ignored. Most people walk into conflict conversations while still neurologically activated from the trigger that created the conflict in the first place. They are already flooded, cortisol already high, prefrontal cortex already partially offline, and they expect themselves to communicate with precision, empathy, and strategic intelligence from that state. It doesn't work. It has never worked. And no amount of wanting to handle it well will override the biology if you skip this stage. Regulation looks different depending on the situation. Sometimes it means requesting a time delay. I want to talk about this, and I want to do it properly. Can we come back to this in 2 hours? Which in American professional culture is often misread as avoidance but is actually the highest form of conflict maturity. Sometimes it means a physical reset, a walk, a few minutes of slow breathing, a deliberate change of environment that signals to your nervous system that the immediate threat has passed. Research from Stanford psychologist James Gross on emotional regulation found that people who developed the ability to regulate their emotional state before engaging in conflict conversations consistently achieved better outcomes. Not just in terms of resolution, but in terms of relationship quality afterward. The conversation they had when regulated was simply a different, more productive conversation than the one they would have had while flooded. The pause before the conflict conversation is not weakness. It is strategy. Stage 2. The validation phase. This is the part that feels counterintuitive, especially to Americans who are culturally conditioned to equate directness with strength and validation with surrender. Before you make your point in any conflict conversation, your first job is to demonstrate, genuinely, specifically, not performatively, that you understand the other person's position. Not that you agree with it, not that you think they're right, but that you have actually taken the time to understand how the world looks from where they are standing. This is validation, and it is the single most disarming tool available in any difficult conversation. Here is why it works neurologically. When a person feels genuinely understood by someone who disagrees with them, the threat response in their brain begins to de-escalate. The amygdala quiets slightly. Blood flow begins returning to the prefrontal cortex. They become, incrementally but meaningfully, more capable of hearing a perspective different from their own. You are not conceding ground by validating someone's viewpoint. You are creating the neurological conditions in which your own perspective can actually be received. It is not softness, it is surgery. You are operating on the emotional state of the conversation before you introduce the information that could inflame it. Validation sounds like this: I understand why you see it that way, and given what you've experienced, that response makes complete sense to me. Or this: before I share my perspective, I want to make sure I've understood yours correctly, because I think it matters. These phrases do not cost you your position. They buy you the other person's willingness to actually listen to it. Stage 3. The clarity phase. This is where most people start, and it is where they should arrive third, not first. Once both nervous systems are regulated, once genuine validation has created an opening, now you speak with clarity. Not with volume. Not with accumulated grievance. Not with the entire history of every related frustration you've been storing since the last difficult conversation you avoided. With clarity. Clarity in conflict means 3 specific things. It means speaking about behaviors, not character. When the report was submitted without the data I requested, the client meeting became very difficult for me, is about a behavior. You're careless and you never think about how your actions affect other people, is about character. And character attacks trigger the deepest, most defensive threat response the brain is capable of, because they are not attacking what someone did. They are attacking who someone is. Clarity means speaking about impact, not intention. You cannot know with certainty what another person intended. You can speak with complete authority about how their actions affected you. When that happened, I felt undermined in front of the team, is unassailable. You did that on purpose to make me look bad, is an interpretation presented as fact. And interpretations presented as facts are the fuel of escalation. And clarity means making a specific request, not delivering a general verdict. What I need going forward is for us to align on deliverables before the client deadline is actionable. You just need to be more professional, is a verdict with no pathway to resolution. It creates shame without creating change. Here is the story that brings all 3 stages to life in a way that will stay with you. There is a couple, call them Marcus and Serena. Married 11 years, living in suburban Atlanta, both working demanding jobs while raising 2 kids. By the time they sat down with a couples therapist, they had had the same argument approximately 40 times. About housework. About distribution of responsibilities. About feeling unseen and undervalued. 40 times. Same argument. Different Tuesday. The therapist watched them begin the conversation and stopped them within 3 minutes. Not because anyone was being cruel, but because both of them were starting at stage 3, jumping directly into clarity, while completely skipping stages 1 and 2. Marcus was still activated from the original trigger before he opened his mouth. Serena was defending her position before she had any indication that Marcus understood it. Both of them were talking about character, you always, you never, you just don't care, instead of behavior. Both of them were delivering verdicts instead of making requests. The therapist restructured the entire conversation. Marcus took 10 minutes before re-engaging. Serena started by articulating Marcus's position back to him accurately and without sarcasm, which took 3 attempts before Marcus nodded and said, quietly, "Yes, that's exactly it." And then, for the first time in 11 years of this argument, Marcus actually heard Serena's position, because his brain was regulated enough and felt understood enough to receive it. They didn't solve everything that day, but they had a different conversation than they had ever had before. And different conversations produce different outcomes. Peace is not the absence of conflict, but the ability to handle conflict by peaceful means. Ronald Reagan. That framing matters deeply, because the goal of powerful conflict communication is never to eliminate disagreement. Disagreement is not a malfunction. It is a feature of any relationship between two independent human beings with different experiences and perspectives. The goal is to handle it in a way that leaves both people feeling more respected, more understood, and more connected than before the conversation began. That is the conflict advantage. The understanding that every hard conversation, navigated with skill, is a deposit into the trust account of that relationship. And over time, the relationships built on that kind of honest, regulated, courageous communication become the most unshakable ones in your life. Here is your recap from Chapter 6 before we move forward. The amygdala hijack explains why most people sound like their least evolved selves during their most important conflicts, because their brain has gone offline at the worst possible moment. The transformation sequence, regulation, validation, and clarity, provides the neurological and practical framework for turning conflict into connection. Speaking about behaviors instead of character, impact instead of intention, and requests instead of verdicts are the three principles of clarity that make resolution actually possible. And every conflict you navigate with skill becomes a trust-building moment that deepens the relationship rather than damaging it. In Chapter 7, we are going to explore one of the most powerful and least understood dynamics in all of professional communication: the psychology of commanding a room. Not through dominance, not through volume, not through the performance of authority, but through the quiet, precise, deeply magnetic presence that makes every person in the room feel like you are speaking directly to them. That is coming up next. Don't go anywhere. Chapter 7. Commanding the Room. How to make every person feel like you're speaking directly to them. Think about the last time you watched someone walk into a room and immediately, without announcing themselves, without raising their voice, without doing anything dramatic or performative, change the entire energy of that space. The conversations shifted. The posture of the people already in the room changed subtly. Eyes moved toward this person without being asked to. And when they finally spoke, the room didn't just go quiet, it went attentive. The kind of attentive that cannot be demanded or manufactured. The kind that happens when something in the collective nervous system of everyone present decides, simultaneously and wordlessly, that this person is worth listening to. You have witnessed that. Most people have. And most people walk away from that experience thinking one of two things. Either that person was born with something they weren't, or that person has a title or a reputation that precedes them and does the work before they open their mouth. Both of those explanations are wrong. What that person has is a set of deeply practiced, entirely learnable skills. Specific behaviors, specific vocal patterns, specific ways of occupying space and directing attention, that together create what communication researchers call executive presence. And executive presence is not a personality type. It is not a gift distributed unevenly at birth. It is a discipline. It is the result of someone deciding at some point that they were going to learn how rooms work, and then learning it. That is exactly what this chapter is going to teach you. Let's begin with the most fundamental and most misunderstood principle of commanding a room, because everything else builds from here. Commanding a room has nothing to do with dominating it. This distinction is critical, particularly in American professional culture, where authority is so frequently confused with aggression, where leadership presence is so often performed through volume, interruption, and the relentless occupation of conversational space. The person who talks most in any room is almost never the person with the most power. They are frequently the person most desperate to establish it. True room command is not about taking space from others. It is about creating space, a quality of presence so grounded, so genuinely attentive, so completely at ease with itself, that other people instinctively orient toward it the way plants orient toward light. Not because they're told to, not because hierarchy demands it, but because something in their nervous system recognizes, at a level below conscious thought, that this person has something worth receiving. Psychologists call this quality referent power, the form of influence that comes not from position or authority but from who you are and how you make people feel in your presence. Research consistently shows that referent power is the most durable, most transferable, and most genuinely effective form of influence available to any communicator. It works in boardrooms and backyards. It works in job interviews and first dates. It works when you have a title and when you don't, because it is not borrowed from a role. It lives in you. So how do you build it? There are 4 specific, trainable elements that together constitute genuine room command. Master all 4, and you will never again walk into a space where your presence goes unnoticed. The first element is intentional entry. Most people enter rooms the same way they enter conversations. Reactively. They walk in already scanning for where they should be, already slightly apologetic for the space they're taking up, already oriented toward the expectations of others rather than grounded in themselves. Their entry is a question rather than a statement. Intentional entry means making a conscious, deliberate decision about how you arrive, physically, energetically, and attentionally, before you cross any threshold. In practical terms, this means pausing outside the room, however briefly, and completing 3 things internally. First, releasing the previous environment, the meeting you just came from, the conversation that's still running in your head, the to-do list competing for your mental bandwidth. You cannot command a room you haven't fully arrived in. Second, setting a clear internal intention, not a performance goal, but a relational one. Not, I want to impress these people, but, I want every person in this room to feel genuinely valued by the time I leave it. That shift in orientation changes everything about how your presence lands. And third, grounding your physical state. Slow breath, shoulders settled, jaw softened, feet fully on the floor. This takes approximately 30 seconds. The impact lasts the entire interaction. The second element is distributed attention. Here is one of the most common mistakes made by presenters, leaders, and communicators in rooms of more than 3 people. They unconsciously direct their attention toward the people who are already engaged. The nodders, the smilers, the ones leaning forward with visible enthusiasm. And in doing so, they abandon everyone else in the room to the experience of being invisible. Distributed attention means making a deliberate practice of ensuring that every person in the room receives a genuine moment of your focused attention. Not a sweeping gaze that lands on everyone without landing on anyone, but actual eye contact held long enough to communicate, I see you specifically. You matter to this conversation. Research on audience engagement from the Communication Research Journal found that individuals who received direct eye contact from a speaker during a presentation rated both the speaker and the content significantly higher than those who did not, even when the content was identical. The feeling of being seen by the person speaking literally changes how the words are received. In a small meeting, distributed attention means making genuine eye contact with each person when making each point. Not rotating mechanically, but responding authentically to the energy of the room while ensuring nobody disappears from your awareness. In a larger room, it means dividing the space into zones and consciously visiting each zone with your attention throughout, so that the person in the back corner feels as addressed as the person in the front row. The room you command is not the room you look at. It is the room that feels looked at by you. The third element is vocal authority. Your voice is an instrument. And like every instrument, it can be played with mastery or played carelessly, and the difference in impact is enormous. There are 4 vocal qualities that, when developed deliberately, transform the authority of everything you say. Pace. Most people, when speaking to a group, unconsciously accelerate. Anxiety drives speed, and speed communicates anxiety, even when the words being delivered are confident. Powerful room communicators speak slower than feels natural in high-stakes moments. Every deliberate deceleration signals certainty. It says, without words, I am not rushing because I am not afraid of this room. Resonance. The depth and fullness of your voice is directly tied to your breath. Shallow, chest-level breathing produces a thin, high, fragile vocal quality. Deep, diaphragmatic breathing produces resonance. The warm, full, grounded vocal quality that registers in the listener's body as well as their ears. Spend 2 weeks consciously breathing from your diaphragm in conversation, and your voice will change in ways that people will notice before you explain why. Strategic variation. The The communicators who lose rooms are not always the ones who are boring. They are often the ones who are consistently anything. Consistently loud, consistently fast, consistently enthusiastic. The brain habituates to consistency and stops paying attention. Strategic variation, dropping your volume to draw people in, slowing your pace before a critical point, pausing completely before the most important sentence, keeps the brain's attention system perpetually engaged, because it never knows quite what's coming next. Declarative endings. This one is subtle and it is devastating when ignored. Many people, particularly under pressure, end their statements with a rising vocal inflection, the same pitch pattern used for questions. The strategy we're proposing is really strong? The brain on the receiving end hears that rising inflection and unconsciously registers it as uncertainty. Every statement delivered with a downward, declarative ending communicates conviction. Every statement delivered with an upward, questioning inflection undermines it, regardless of how confident the words themselves are. The fourth element is the management of your reactions. In a room of people, every visible reaction you have to what's happening, every micro-expression, every subtle shift in posture, every flash of irritation or surprise or discomfort, is being read and interpreted by the people watching you. This is not paranoia. This is neuroscience. The human brain contains mirror neurons, cells that fire in response to observing the emotional states of others, essentially creating a shared emotional experience between observer and observed. Which means that when you react visibly to a challenging question with a flicker of defensiveness, everyone in the room feels a flicker of defensiveness. When you respond to unexpected news with visible anxiety, the anxiety spreads. But when you receive difficulty with visible steadiness, when your face communicates "I have heard harder things than this and I am still here," the calm transmits just as powerfully. The most commanding presence in any room is rarely the most expressive one. It is the most regulated one. The person whose reactions are chosen rather than reflexive. Whose steadiness in the face of difficulty becomes the emotional anchor that everyone else in the room unconsciously reaches for. Here is the story that makes this real. There is a man, call him David, a non-profit director in Los Angeles who had spent 15 years doing extraordinary work in his community but consistently struggled to attract major donors. He was passionate, knowledgeable, and deeply credible. But in high-stakes donor meetings, something kept falling flat. A communications consultant watched him present and identified the problem within the first 5 minutes. David entered the room already talking, filling the space with words before anyone had settled. His eye contact went almost exclusively to the lead donor and ignored 2 other decision-makers sitting at the same table. His voice accelerated when he was most passionate, precisely when he needed it to slow down. And every time he received a skeptical question, a barely perceptible flash of anxiety crossed his face before he answered. The consultant gave him 4 assignments before his next major presentation. Pause outside the door for 30 seconds before entering. Make deliberate eye contact with every person in the room within the first 2 minutes. Slow his pace by 30% when discussing the most important data. And practice receiving hard questions in a mirror until his face could hold steadiness regardless of what was asked. His next major donor meeting resulted in the largest single contribution his organization had ever received. The mission hadn't changed. The data hadn't changed. The need hadn't changed. The room command had changed, and it changed everything. You never get a second chance to make a first impression, but you get 1,000 chances to deepen it. This wisdom, held by communicators across generations, captures something essential about room command. The entry matters. The first impression matters. But the sustained quality of your presence, the distributed attention, the vocal authority, the regulated reactions, is what transforms a first impression into a lasting one. Commanding a room is not a performance you put on for important occasions. It is a standard you hold for yourself in every room you enter, because every room contains human beings who deserve the full quality of your presence. And when you give that, consistently, deliberately, genuinely, the rooms begin to remember you long after you've left them. Here is your recap from Chapter 7 before we move forward. Room command is built on referent power, the influence that comes from presence rather than position. The 4 trainable elements of genuine room command are intentional entry, distributed attention, vocal authority, and the management of your reactions. Your voice is an instrument. Pace, resonance, strategic variation, and declarative endings are the 4 qualities that transform its authority. And the most commanding presence in any room is not the most expressive one. It is the most regulated one, whose steadiness becomes the emotional anchor that everyone else unconsciously reaches for. In Chapter 8, we are going to go into the world of digital communication, the texts, the emails, the Slack messages, the LinkedIn replies, and reveal why most people are destroying their professional credibility one poorly written message at a time, and exactly how to communicate with the same psychological power in writing that we've been building in person throughout this entire audiobook. That is coming up next. And in an era where so much of your influence happens through a screen, this chapter might be the most immediately applicable one yet. Stay with us. Chapter 8. The Digital Voice. Why most people are destroying their credibility one message at a time. Right now, somewhere in America, a genuinely talented professional is losing an opportunity they worked months to create, and they have absolutely no idea it's happening. Not because their work isn't strong. Not because their reputation isn't solid. Not because the person on the other end of the conversation doesn't respect them. But because of a 3-line email they sent at 11 p.m. that landed wrong. Or a Slack message that read as passive-aggressive when they meant it as casual. Or a LinkedIn reply so generic and hollow that the person who received it mentally filed its author under not worth pursuing further before they finished reading the second sentence. Digital communication is the invisible graveyard of professional credibility in modern America. And the reason it claims so many victims is that it feels effortless, which is precisely what makes it dangerous. When something requires no effort to produce, the brain assigns it no particular weight. You fire off the message. You move on. You never see the face of the person reading it, never feel the shift in their perception, never know that the version of you living in their mind just became a little smaller than you actually are. Here is what the research says about the scale of this problem, and it is genuinely sobering. A study from Carleton University found that tone is misread in email approximately 50% of the time. 1 out of every 2 emails you send, your intention, your warmth, your nuance, your care, is being decoded incorrectly by the person receiving it. And because they cannot see your face, cannot hear your voice, cannot access the 93% of communication that happens non-verbally, they are filling that gap with their own assumptions, their own current emotional state, and their own interpretation of who you are. You are not communicating who you are in most of your digital messages. You are giving other people the raw material to construct a version of you, and then living with the consequences of the version they build. That ends today. Let's understand the core problem before we solve it, because the solution makes far more sense once you see the mechanics of what's going wrong. When you communicate in person, you have an enormous array of real-time feedback tools working in your favor. You can see when a joke lands flat and course-correct immediately. You can sense when your message has been misunderstood and clarify before it calcifies into a wrong impression. You can feel the emotional temperature of the room and adjust your delivery accordingly. Digital communication strips all of that away. Every message you send enters a vacuum, a space where context is absent, tone is ambiguous, and the recipient's brain is left alone with your words and its own interpretive framework. And here is the critical insight. When the brain receives ambiguous communication, words without vocal tone, without facial expression, without the full human context that normally surrounds language, it does not suspend judgment until more information becomes available. It defaults to the negative. This is called the negativity bias, the brain's deeply ingrained tendency to weight potential threats more heavily than neutral or positive signals, a survival mechanism that served our ancestors exceptionally well when the ambiguous rustle in the bushes might be a predator. In the context of digital communication, that negativity bias means that your neutral email reads as slightly cold. Your brief reply reads as dismissive. Your direct message reads as curt or annoyed. Your professional boundary reads as unfriendly. None of these were your intention. All of them are the default interpretation of ambiguity in the absence of warmth signals, which means that in digital communication, neutrality is not neutral. Neutrality is a deficit, and closing that deficit requires deliberate, specific, learnable techniques. Here are the 5 principles of psychologically powerful digital communication, built directly from the research on how the brain processes written language in professional and personal contexts. Principle 1. Lead with the human before the business. Most professional emails in America follow the same structural pattern. Subject line, immediate statement of purpose, request or information, sign off. Clean, efficient, and completely stripped of the relational warmth that makes the recipient feel like they're communicating with a person rather than a process. The most effective digital communicators, the ones whose messages get responded to fastest, whose requests get fulfilled most readily, whose professional relationships deepen consistently over time, have developed the habit of leading with a single, genuine human acknowledgement before transitioning to business content. Not a performative formality. Not, "I hope this email finds you well," which has been so overused it has become the written equivalent of elevator music, present but unregistered. A genuine, specific, human acknowledgement. "Congratulations on the product launch last week. The response on LinkedIn looked incredible." Or, "I know you've had a packed quarter. I appreciate you making time for this." Or simply, when the relationship warrants it, a brief personal connection that says, "I see you as a human being, not just a professional function." This takes 11 additional seconds to write. The relational return on those 11 seconds is enormous, because the brain that receives genuine human acknowledgement before a business request is neurologically primed to respond more favorably to everything that follows. Principle 2. Write for the worst possible day. This principle will change the way you compose every significant message for the rest of your professional life. Before you send any important digital communication, ask yourself one question. How will this land if the person receiving it is having the worst day of their month? Because you don't know what's happening on the other end of your message. You don't know if they just received difficult news, just had a frustrating call, just navigated a painful interaction that has their nervous system already primed for threat. You don't know if they're exhausted, overwhelmed, or operating at the edge of their bandwidth. And a message that reads as perfectly reasonable to a regulated, resourced person can read as cold, demanding, or dismissive to someone already running on empty. Writing for the worst possible day doesn't mean softening every message into meaninglessness. It means building in enough warmth, enough specificity of tone, enough genuine humanness that the message holds its intended meaning even when received by someone whose interpretive filters are at their most defensive. A practical technique for this: after drafting any important message, read it aloud in the most uncharitable tone you can imagine. If it sounds bad when read uncharitably, it needs more warmth before it goes. Principle 3. The architecture of your message communicates before the content does. Most people think about what they're saying in a digital message. Almost nobody thinks about the visual and structural impression their message creates before the recipient has read a single word. Long, dense, unbroken paragraphs in an email communicate overwhelm, and overwhelmed brains procrastinate. They file the message under "deal with later," which in practice often means "deal with never." Short, broken, breathable text communicates respect for the recipient's time and attention. It says, "I have organized my thinking so you don't have to do that work." Subject lines that are vague, following up, quick question, checking in, create low open rates and low response urgency because they communicate nothing about value or relevance. Specific subject lines, 2 questions about Thursday's presentation, or update on the Henderson account, action needed by Friday, communicate exactly what's being asked and why it matters, which dramatically increases both open rate and response speed. And the length of your message is itself a statement about your relationship with the recipient's time. Unnecessary length is a form of disrespect that most people never recognize as such, because in the sender's mind, more words signal more effort, more care, more thoroughness. But in the recipient's mind, unnecessary length signals poor editing, unclear thinking, or insufficient regard for how valuable their attention is. Brevity, in digital communication is not laziness. Brevity is mastery. Principle 4. Punctuation and formatting carry emotional weight. This principle lives at the intersection of linguistics and psychology, and it has become dramatically more important in the era of texting and instant messaging. The period has changed. In formal written English, the period is simply a grammatical endpoint. In digital messaging, in texts, in Slack, in any informal written communication, a period at the end of a short message now carries an emotional signal that linguists have identified as finality or coldness. Sounds good. Reads differently than sounds good. Not grammatically, but emotionally. Fine. In a text message does not read as neutral in 2026 American digital culture. It reads as the written equivalent of a sharp exhale through the nose. Exclamation points, used judiciously, inject warmth into digital communication. They signal enthusiasm and approachability. Overused, they lose their impact and begin to read as performative or even manic. 1 or 2 per message, placed where they genuinely reflect your emotional state, is the sweet spot. Capitalization, spacing, and response time also carry emotional data. Responding to a message 3 days later without acknowledgement of the delay communicates indifference regardless of how warm the content of your reply is. A brief, "Apologies for the slow reply. This week has been relentless," before your actual response costs you nothing and recovers the warmth that the delay eroded. Principle 5. Reread before you send. Always, without exception. This sounds painfully obvious. Almost nobody does it consistently. Not a skim. Not a glance. A genuine, full read of the message as if you are receiving it for the first time. Specifically looking for anywhere the tone could be misread, anywhere the request is unclear, anywhere the message could land harder or colder than you intend. Research on professional communication errors finds that the vast majority of damaging digital messages share one characteristic. They were written and sent in a single motion, without a beat of reflective review between composition and delivery. The pause between writing and sending is where your communication intelligence lives. It is the digital equivalent of the reflective silence we discussed in Chapter 4, the space between impulse and action where the most important decisions get made. 20 seconds of genuine rereading before you send has the potential to save you from communication errors whose repair can take weeks. Here is the story that makes this undeniable. There is a woman, call her Nicole, a marketing director in Seattle, mid-30s, widely respected within her organization, being quietly considered for a VP role. She was strong in every metric. Her work was excellent, her results were compelling, and her in-person presence was warm and commanding. But she had a habit, a small, unconscious, entirely unexamined habit, of sending brief, uncontextualized replies to her team's messages. Got it. Will review. Fine. See you then. Fast, efficient, and, to Nicole, completely neutral. To her team, over months, those messages accumulated into a portrait of a leader who was too busy to care. Too important to engage. Technically present but emotionally absent from the digital environment where her team spent most of their communicative day. When her performance review included unexpected feedback about team morale, Nicole was genuinely blindsided. She cared deeply about her team. She showed up for them consistently in person. But in the place where they actually spent most of their time communicating with her, in writing, digitally, asynchronously, she had been sending an entirely different signal than she intended. She spent 30 days applying one simple rule. Every reply to a team member would contain at least one sentence of genuine human acknowledgement before any business content. Not long. Not elaborate. Just human. The shift in team morale was measurable within 6 weeks. Not because the work changed, because the person they experienced in their inboxes finally matched the person they knew in the room. The art of communication is the language of leadership. James Humes. And in the modern American professional landscape, leadership happens as much in written pixels as in spoken words. Your digital voice is not a lesser version of your real voice, it is an extension of it. And it deserves the same intentionality, the same care, the same psychological sophistication that you are now bringing to every in-person conversation. You are not just sending messages. You are building, or quietly eroding, your professional identity one digital interaction at a time. And now you know exactly how to make every message work for you instead of against you. Here is your recap from Chapter 8 before we move forward. The brain's negativity bias means that neutral digital communication defaults to negative interpretation, which means warmth must be deliberately built in, not assumed. The 5 principles of psychologically powerful digital communication are: lead with the human before the business, write for the worst possible day, architect your message for clarity and breathability, understand that punctuation and formatting carry emotional weight, and always reread before you send. Your digital voice is building your professional identity in every message. And the communicators who master their written presence in an era dominated by screens hold an extraordinary advantage over everyone still treating their inbox as an afterthought. In Chapter 9, we are going to tackle the communication skill that separates people who are simply good at their jobs from people who become genuinely unforgettable. The art of storytelling as a strategic tool. Not storytelling for entertainment, but storytelling as the most powerful vehicle for persuasion, leadership, and human connection that has ever existed. That is coming up next, and it might be the chapter that unlocks everything else we've built in this audiobook. Don't go anywhere. Chapter 9. The Storyteller's Edge. How to make your words impossible to forget. Somewhere around 35,000 years ago, long before the first city was built, long before the first written word was scratched into clay, long before anything we would recognize as civilization existed, human beings were gathered around fires, doing something that no other species on Earth has ever done. They were telling stories, not communicating information, not issuing warnings, not exchanging survival data, though stories did all of those things. They were constructing narratives, giving events characters and consequences, building worlds with language that existed only in the space between one person's mouth and another person's imagination. And in doing so, they were creating the most powerful technology for transferring ideas between human minds that has ever been invented. 35,000 years later, with all of our data and research in neuroscience and artificial intelligence, the most effective communicators on Earth are still doing exactly the same thing. They are telling stories. And the people who cannot, the ones who lead with data, who bury their message in statistics, who present their ideas as logical propositions rather than human narratives, are losing the room to people who understand something fundamental about how the human brain actually works. The brain was not built for data. The brain was built for story. And once you truly understand what that means, not just intellectually, but in the way you prepare for every important conversation, you will never present an idea, make a request, or try to move another human being the same way again. Let's go inside the neuroscience because the research here is extraordinary and it explains everything. When you present data to another person, statistics, facts, logical arguments, evidence, 2 areas of the brain activate. Wernicke's area, which processes language, and Broca's area, which processes meaning. 2 regions. Information received, decoded, stored. The brain has done its job. Now watch what happens when you tell a story. Neuroscientist Yuri Hassan at Princeton University conducted landmark research on what happens in the brain during storytelling, and what he found changed the field permanently. When a person listens to a well-told story, it is not just the language processing areas that activate. The motor cortex activates, the part of the brain that controls physical movement, because the brain is physically simulating the actions being described. The sensory cortex activates. The brain is feeling the textures, temperatures, and sensations of the story's environment. The emotional centers activate. The brain is experiencing the feelings of the characters. Hassan called this phenomenon neural coupling. The story literally synchronizes the brain of the listener with the brain of the teller. They are not just exchanging information. They are sharing a neurological experience. The story is not being received from a distance. It is being lived in real time by the person hearing it. And here is the implication that should stop every communicator cold. Information that is merely heard is forgotten at a rate of approximately 70% within 24 hours. Information embedded in a story is retained at rates up to 22 times higher than the same information presented as data alone. 22 times. That is not a marginal advantage. That is a complete transformation of the communication landscape, and it is available to every single person willing to learn how stories actually work. The question, then, is not whether you should use storytelling in your communication. The question is how to do it with the precision and intentionality that separates a story that captivates from a story that merely fills time. Because here is the thing about storytelling that most people get wrong. They confuse it with anecdote. An anecdote is a sequence of events. Something happened, then something else happened, then it ended. An anecdote can be interesting. An anecdote can be entertaining. But an anecdote rarely moves people, rarely changes minds, rarely produces the neurological engagement that makes information stick for 22 times longer than data alone. A story is something categorically different, and the difference comes down to structure. Every story that has ever moved a human being, from the oldest myths to the newest Netflix series to the TED Talk that made you pull over your car so you could keep listening, is built on the same fundamental architecture. Psychologists and narrative researchers call it the story spine, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it in every powerful piece of communication you encounter. It has 5 elements. Master these 5 elements, and you can construct a compelling story from virtually any experience, any idea, or any piece of information in your life. Element 1. The relatable starting point. Every powerful story begins with a world the audience can inhabit. A character, a situation, a context that the listener can map onto their own experience. That triggers the brain's pattern matching system and says, "This is familiar, this is real, this is about someone like me." The starting point does not need to be dramatic. It does not need to be exotic or extraordinary. In fact, the more ordinary and recognizable the opening situation, the more powerfully the brain engages. Because the gap between ordinary and extraordinary is where all emotional momentum lives. Element 2. The disruption. Every story requires a moment when the ordinary world is disturbed. When something changes, something breaks, something unexpected arrives. This is the engine of narrative tension. The moment the brain's prediction system is activated, the open loop is created, and the listener becomes neurologically committed to finding out what happens next. In professional storytelling, in pitches, in presentations, in persuasive conversations, the disruption is almost always the problem. The challenge that existed before your solution. The gap between where things were and where they needed to be. The tension that made change necessary. Without this disruption, there is no story. Only a pleasant sequence of events that the brain has no particular reason to remember. Element 3. The struggle. This is the element most professional communicators skip, and it is the element most responsible for whether a story creates genuine emotional engagement or merely mild interest. The struggle is the authentic, unvarnished account of what it actually costs to navigate the disruption. The confusion, the failed attempts, the moments of doubt, the things that didn't work before the thing that finally did. The struggle is where the human truth of the story lives, and it is the part the brain finds most compelling, because the brain is wired to learn from watching others navigate difficulty. When you skip the struggle, when you jump from problem to solution without acknowledging the real human cost of the journey between them, you produce a story that feels sanitized, unconvincing, and ultimately forgettable. The struggle is not the embarrassing part of the story. The struggle is the relatable part. And relatable is the most powerful word in the storyteller's vocabulary. Element 4. The turn. The turn is the moment of change. The insight gained, the decision made, the action taken that shifts the trajectory of the story from descent to ascent. The turn is satisfying to the brain because it closes the open loop created by the disruption. It answers the question the brain has been holding since the moment the ordinary world was disturbed. In persuasive communication, the turn is almost always the introduction of your idea, your product, your approach, your solution, positioned not as a logical proposition but as the organic answer to the human struggle the audience has just been living alongside. When your solution arrives at the turn of a well-constructed story, it does not feel like a sales pitch. It feels like relief. Element 5. The New World. Every powerful story ends not where it began but in a transformed state. The New World is the concrete, specific, emotionally resonant description of life after the turn. What changed, what became possible, what the character now has access to that they didn't have before. The New World is the vision. And vision, held in the container of a story rather than the container of a bullet point, is what moves human beings from passive agreement to genuine action. Now let's bring in the practical layer, because knowing the structure is one thing, using it in real time is another. The most immediately applicable form of the story spine in professional American communication is what storytelling coaches call the "someone like you" story. A first or third person narrative built specifically around a protagonist whose situation mirrors the situation of the person you're trying to reach. It works like this. Instead of saying, "Our approach has been proven to increase team productivity by 34%, which is data, which 2 of the people in the room will remember tomorrow and everyone else will forget by dinner," you say, "Let me tell you about a team leader in Chicago who was facing exactly the situation you're describing right now." And then you tell the story. The relatable starting point. A team leader, a challenge, a world the listener can recognize. The disruption. The moment the problem became undeniable. The struggle. The honest, human account of what they tried before they found what worked. The turn. The moment the approach changed. The new world. What their team looked like 6 months later, in specific, tangible, emotionally resonant terms. By the time you return to the 34% statistic, it is no longer a number floating in the air. It is a number attached to a human experience that the listener has just neurologically lived alongside. It is not data anymore. It is evidence. And evidence embedded in story lands in a completely different place in the brain than evidence presented as abstract fact. Here is the story that proves the point. And yes, the deliberate recursion here is entirely intentional. There is a man, call him Andre, a startup founder in San Francisco who had spent 18 months building a genuinely innovative platform for small business financial management. His technology was strong. His numbers were compelling. His market opportunity was real. He had pitched 43 investors. He had received 43 rejections. A pitch coach finally asked him to walk through his standard presentation. Within 10 minutes, the coach held up her hand and said, "Andre, you are presenting a business case. You need to be telling a human story." His entire pitch was data, market size, revenue projections, feature comparisons, growth metrics. Every slide was a logical argument for why his company deserved investment. And every investor left those meetings intellectually convinced but emotionally unmoved, which, as we established in Chapter 5, means the decision always went toward no. The coach restructured his pitch around a single story, the story of a real small business owner named Patricia, who had spent 12 years running a bakery in Oakland, who lost sleep every Sunday night doing books she barely understood, whose business nearly failed not because her food wasn't extraordinary but because her finances were invisible to her until it was almost too late, and who, using Andre's platform, saw her business clearly for the first time and made 3 decisions in the first month that turned a struggling operation into a profitable one. Same data, same technology, same market opportunity, different container. His next pitch resulted in a term sheet within 2 weeks. 3 more followed in the next 60 days. The technology didn't change. The story did. Marketing is no longer about the stuff you make, but about the stories you tell. Seth Godin. And while Godin was speaking about marketing specifically, the truth he's pointing at is universal. In every domain of human communication, the story is the delivery vehicle for everything that matters. Your ideas, your values, your vision, your request. Everything lands deeper, sticks longer, and moves people further when it arrives inside a story than when it arrives as a proposition. You have stories. Every experience you have lived, every challenge you have navigated, every lesson you have learned. all of it is raw material for the most powerful communication tool available to any human being. The only question is whether you are going to leave that material unused, or whether you are going to shape it with intention and use it to change the rooms you walk into. The storyteller's edge is not a gift. It is a decision. Here is your recap from Chapter 9 before we move forward. The brain activates across multiple regions during storytelling: motor, sensory, and emotional, creating neural coupling between speaker and listener. Information embedded in story is retained up to 22 times more effectively than information presented as data alone. The 5 elements of the story spine: the relatable starting point, the disruption, the struggle, the turn, and the new world, are the architecture of every story that has ever moved a human being. And the "someone like you" story is the most immediately applicable professional storytelling tool available, because it makes the listener the hero before you've asked them for anything. Chapter 10 is the final chapter of this audiobook, and it is the one we have been building toward from the very first word. We are going to bring together every principle, every framework, every insight from all 9 chapters that came before, and show you exactly what it looks like when a human being walks through the world as a truly powerful communicator. This is where everything comes together. The last chapter. The full picture. Do not go anywhere. We are almost there. Stay with us. Chapter 10. The complete communicator. Everything you've learned, and the person you're becoming. You made it. Not just to the final chapter of this audiobook, but through something more significant than that. Through 10 chapters of neuroscience, psychology, real human stories, and practical frameworks that most people will spend their entire lives never encountering, never applying, and never allowing to change the way they move through the world. The fact that you are still here, that you chose to stay through every chapter, every concept, every story, tells you something important about yourself. It tells you that somewhere beneath the daily noise of your life, you have always known that the way you communicate is connected to everything you want. Every relationship you want to deepen. Every room you want to command. Every opportunity you want to create. Every version of yourself you are still working toward becoming. That knowing brought you here. And what you do with what you've learned now determines everything that comes next. So before we close, let's do something that no chapter in this audiobook has done yet. Let's bring the entire journey together, not as a summary, but as a portrait. A picture of what a truly powerful communicator looks like in a single, ordinary American day. Because the principles you've learned are not for special occasions. They are not tools you pull out for high-stakes moments and set aside when life feels routine. They are a way of being. And a way of being only becomes real when it becomes constant. Now let's talk about where you go from here. Because this is the part of the audiobook that the listening experience cannot fully deliver. The part that only you can provide. Knowledge, without application, is the most comfortable form of stagnation available to ambitious people. You can know everything in this audiobook, every framework, every neuroscience finding, every story and principle and practical technique, and change absolutely nothing about your life, because knowing and doing are separated by the single widest gap in all of human development. The gap is called discomfort. Every principle in this audiobook requires you to behave differently than you currently behave, and different behavior, even better behavior, feels wrong before it feels right. The first time you hold silence after making a request, the discomfort will be almost unbearable. The first time you lead with the emotional layer before making your argument, it will feel indirect and unnatural. The first time you pause outside a room and set an intention before entering, you will feel slightly ridiculous. That feeling of slight ridiculousness is not a signal that you are doing something wrong. That feeling is the sensation of growth, of your behavior moving ahead of your comfort zone, which is the only direction growth has ever existed. As Brené Brown said, you can choose courage or you can choose comfort. You cannot have both. Powerful communication is an act of courage. It requires you to be more present than is easy, more honest than is comfortable, more patient than feels natural, and more genuinely interested in other human beings than a culture built on distraction and self-promotion typically rewards. But the return, the quality of life that opens up on the other side of that courage, is not comparable to anything the comfortable version of communication can offer. So here is what you do tomorrow. Not next week. Not when the timing is better. Tomorrow. You pick one principle from this audiobook, just one, and you make it your deliberate practice for the next 7 days. Not all 10 chapters simultaneously. Not a complete overhaul of every communicative behavior you have. One principle, applied with genuine intention, in every relevant conversation for 7 days. Maybe it is the listen to understand pause from chapter 3. The one internal question that shifts your entire orientation before you respond. Maybe it is the pressure pause from chapter 4. The discipline of staying quiet after your next important ask. Maybe it is leading with the human before the business in your next 5 significant emails. Maybe it is pausing outside the next 3 rooms you enter and setting a genuine relational intention before you cross the threshold. Whatever you choose it specifically, practice it deliberately, and notice what changes. Because something will change. It always does when a human being decides to become more intentional about how they show up for other human beings. And then, in 7 days, you add the next principle. And 7 days after that, the next one. Not as a self-improvement project with a completion date, but as a permanent, ongoing, endlessly deepening practice of becoming the communicator and the human being that the people in your life deserve to encounter. Before we close, there is one more thing that needs to be said, and it is perhaps the most important thing in this entire audiobook. All of these principles, the neuroscience, the frameworks, the strategies, the techniques, they are tools. And tools are only as meaningful as the intention behind the hand that holds them. Powerful communication used in service of manipulation, to take from people, to deceive them, to engineer outcomes at the expense of their dignity and well-being, is not powerful communication. It is a corruption of it. And it produces, inevitably, the loneliness and distrust that come from a life built on performance rather than genuine connection. The communicators who change the world, the ones whose words echo beyond the rooms they spoke them in, whose influence outlasts their presence, whose legacy is written in the transformed lives of the people they reached, they are not the ones who were most strategic. They are the ones who were most genuinely, most courageously, most consistently human. They made people feel seen when the world was making them invisible. They made people feel heard when everything around them was noise. They made people feel known, specifically, personally, irreplaceably known, in a culture that increasingly processes human beings as data points. That is the highest form of communication, and it is available to you, not because you are the most eloquent person in the room, not because you have the largest vocabulary or the most prestigious title or the most impressive credentials, but because you are willing to show up fully, to listen deeply, to speak honestly, to sit in difficult silence, to navigate hard conversations with grace, to tell true stories, to write with warmth, to enter every room as if every person in it deserves the complete quality of your presence. Because they do. Every single one of them does. The most powerful person in the world is the storyteller. The storyteller sets the vision, values, and agenda of an entire generation yet to come. Steve Jobs. You are that storyteller now. Not just for audiences and boardrooms and negotiation tables, but for the people sitting across from you at dinner tonight. For the colleague who needs to feel understood tomorrow morning. For the child watching how you handle difficulty. For the stranger whose day you might change with the quality of a single, genuine, fully present conversation. You have spent the last 2.5 hours building something that most people will spend their entire lives without. A deep, practical, neuroscience-grounded understanding of how human communication actually works and how to make yours work powerfully, consistently, and authentically. Do not let it live only here, in this audiobook, as a memory of something you once heard. Let it live in your next conversation, and the one after that, and every one that follows. That is where the real audiobook begins. In the world you walk back into the moment this ends. Here is the complete picture, one final time, of everything you now carry with you. Your body communicates before your mouth does. And the invisible signal you broadcast in the first 7 seconds of any encounter is either working for you or against you, starting right now. The words you choose are neurological events happening inside another person's brain. And the difference between language that opens and language that closes is the difference between influence and resistance. Listening at all 3 levels, content, emotion, and identity, makes people feel not just heard but genuinely known, which is among the rarest and most powerful gifts one human being can offer another. Strategic silence is one of the most sophisticated communication tools ever discovered. And the person who masters the discipline of purposeful quiet becomes the one every room leans in to hear. Human beings make decisions with emotion and justify them with logic, which means the emotional architecture of your communication matters more than the logical structure every single time. Conflict, navigated with regulation, validation, and clarity, is not a threat to your relationships. It is the building material of your best ones. Commanding a room has nothing to do with dominating it. It is the referent power that comes from distributed attention, vocal authority, and the steadiness that becomes everyone else's anchor. Your digital voice is building or quietly eroding your professional identity one message at a time. And in an era dominated by screens, warmth must be deliberately constructed, not assumed. Story is the most powerful delivery vehicle for every idea you will ever want to move through another human mind. And the 5 elements of the story spine are the architecture of everything that has ever changed anyone's mind, heart, or direction. And beneath all 9 of those principles lives the 10th, the one that makes every other one true. Every person you speak to is a full, complex, irreplaceable human being who deserves your complete, genuine, fully present attention. And when you give them that, consistently, courageously, and without condition, you become the rarest kind of communicator alive. Not the loudest, not the cleverest, not the most strategically impressive, the most real. And real, in a world drowning in performance, is the most powerful thing you can possibly be. Thank you for spending this time with Mindset Audiobooks. If this audiobook moved something in you, if even one chapter gave you a framework that will change a single conversation in your life, please take 30 seconds right now and leave a review. Share this with someone who needs it. Subscribe to this channel because we are just getting started. And the next audiobook we drop is already being built for the version of you that finishes listening to this one. You are not the same communicator you were 2 hours ago. Now go prove it.